Hello, good afternoon. Thank you so much for being here for our program today. My name is Danielle Knapp. I'm the MCCOSH curator here at the museum. And I'm so thankful to the members of our MCCOSH Advisory Committee and the David and Ann McCosh Memorial Museum Endowment Fund that we have here at the museum to use to support programs, exhibitions, projects related to David and Ann McCosh's life and work, and other projects related to Pacific Northwest art in the 20th century and in contemporary times. And so that's how the lecture series that you're here to attend today, our annual McCosh Memorial Visiting Lecture Series, came about a few years ago, was wanting to find ways that we could really invite scholars who are working in interesting areas of Pacific Northwest art history and culture to come and share their research with us here in Eugene, and then also to bring those individuals here to our campus to be introduced to what we're doing at our museum and our collections, certainly the McCosh Memorial Collection, but also our exhibition programming, our academic support mission. And so that's been a pleasure over the last day to spend time with our speaker, Michael Holloman, and just give him a sense of what we're doing here that we're excited about and the artists we're excited about in our collection, and connect him with some of our students who are working on really interesting aspects of museum practice and research. So our lecturer today, Michael Holloman, is a tenured professor at Washington State University in Pullman, which is also home of a new Jordan Schnitzer Museum of Art. The campus at WSU had a new building open over a year ago with that name. And he teaches Native American art history and studio art there, and is also the drawing coordinator for the studio art department. He has been at WSU since 2010, when he arrived as director of the Plateau Center for American Indian Studies. And prior to that role, he directed all of the American Indian programming at the Museum of Northwest Arts and Culture in Spokane, Washington. So exhibitions, collections, educational programming. He is a registered member of the Confederated Tribes of the Colville Indian Reservation and a former Duck himself, having spent some time here early in his undergraduate career. So we're so pleased to have you back today to share your research with us. And thank you for being here. And let's go ahead and welcome Michael.
Thank you. Thank you, Danielle. I was told I have a couple hours. I'm going to try to keep it down just to about an hour and a half. It is nice to be back to Eugene, and surely some memories have come back being here on campus again. I want to thank all of you for coming. I have the privilege to have family here today, colleagues, and some new friends that I've met, and so it's been a wonderful day already that I've been here. Before we get started, I want to give thanks to being here, not just at the campus, but to the traditional homelands here of the Kalapuya, the Miala, the names that maybe we don't hear much anymore. The descendants of those people maybe aren't around. We don't meet them. The spirits are surely here. And so coming from my background, I think it's very important. I kind of acknowledge that, and I would like to. Speaking of my family, I usually, when I start, I'll speak to, I don't want to make assumptions when I talk about the Columbia Plateau, where certain places that I'll be talking about exist. But in some ways, what I'm addressing is the watershed of the Columbia River and all the rivers that flow into it at some point. And within that are tribes that I've worked with, have been affiliated with their material culture and educational cultural programming for years. And that was a big part of my duties at the Northwest Museum of Arts and Culture, and of course still at Washington State University. And so with that, I just wanted to kind of give this map and this sense of how large that area is. Okay. And so with that, what I wanted to be able to do is just give this sense of how the people of this region really were river people, and that was the culture and identity. And it's not just the river, it was salmon. The whole kind of basis of Plateau Indian culture historically was salmon. And all the salmon runs and that extended all the way up into almost Alberta, all the way east to the Wyoming border, all these areas that connected the people, and they were connected. through those rivers. And so the intermarriage, the interaction was tremendous with that. But on a more personal note, this is my homelands where I'm from. My mother was full-blood Indian. She met my father after the Korean War on the Colville Indian Reservation. Okay, this is new for me. Oh, there we go. I had to try that. Okay. And they got together. My father was a social worker that got a job there after the war. And so my childhood was between the Colville Indian Reservation and Olympia, Washington, where my dad ended up being a social worker for the state of Washington at the state offices in Olympia. But I guess, where I kind of wanted to start is maybe just give you a little personal background. I pulled these images out. The one on the left, of course, is Fritz Scholder, a fabulous, kind of wonderful Native American artist that died, a couple of years ago, actually. Fritz, just to be, he was one of the first artists that I saw. I had this fabulous high school art teacher. And to be honest, she wasn't that great of a high art teacher. She was good at ceramics, but she was really good at art history. And that's what I was able to get from her. And one day she brought in a magazine, and it was kind of Cowboys and Indians magazine. But in it was an article on new Native American artists. And I looked at this article, and I knew then and there what I wanted to do. Because up to that point, people knowing that my family, my mother's family are Native American, when they'd ask about any art that I did, they wanted to know if I did traditional arts. What did I do carving? Did I do beading? What are the things that I did? And my family did do some beading, but that was the expectation I had back in the 70s, that this is what I would do. And when I saw this article on these new Native American artists, I thought, that's what I want to do. And my mother was an artist. She went to Haskell Indian College in Lawrence, Kansas in the 50s, early 50s. And so she did art. She did art with us at home. And I had been drawing and painting since I was a little boy. But when I saw what these artists were doing in the 1970s, I was really excited. And so with that, I wanted to highlight two of the probably more famous artists from that era, with T.C. Cannon and Fritz Scholder. And the reason I kind of maybe start there, because I think maybe that next transition was when I finished undergraduate school, I went to San Francisco, and I was working at Fort Mason, which is this kind of art institute for the city colleges there. And I was taking printmaking classes. And what was fabulous about that experience was that I was, I think, one of the only people actually taking the classes for credit. Everyone else were actual working artists, printmakers. And of course, they couldn't afford to have their own print studio in the city, so they all just paid their lab fee and their audit fee and all printed there. And so for me, that experience to be working with these professional printmakers was fabulous. But every year around Christmas, they had their annual print show. And unbeknownst to me, that the annual print show was kind of the pecking order of who was the top printer there, and because who sold the most. And so everyone would come before the holidays and buy prints and different things. And there was this one woman I worked with named Danielle. She was a little older than I was. I was 21, so she was maybe 25. So she's an older woman. And I kind of liked her. And Danielle had been taking scrupulous notes for a number of years. And she paid attention to what prints sold the most, and what the medium was, what the subject matter was, what the kind of stylistic quality was of these prints. And she had come to the conclusion that what the audience wanted was big monoprints, brightly colored, of Indian chiefs. And she outsold everyone. And they found out. Somehow it came out what she was doing. Half the artists were insulted. How dare her? This isn't, this is cultural appropriation. You can't be doing this. Then the other kind of younger artists maybe, yes, Danielle, because she was making money, and everyone was trying to sell something. But then some of them came up to me. Well, what do you think, Michael? And I didn't want to say anything. I kind of liked Danielle. I didn't want to, have to say anything. But it ended up to me, as much as it's a real story, it was emblematic of some things. And I guess maybe, if I have a chance today to maybe talk about a few things, what happened there? What happened with that situation? And how did that come about to where American Indians and these things became all of a sudden that popular, that it became that important? And so with that, I think, I'll move on, and instead of maybe answering that specific question about that specific scenario, maybe I'll change the context a bit and offer a talk a bit today, with the little time I do have, about a topical overview of maybe Edward Curtis's construction of authentic visual artifacts, a comparison and contrast between Edward S. Curtis and Frank Matsura as early 20th century photographers, for all intent purposes, an awareness of Timothy Egan's 2012 bestseller on Edward Curtis, Short Nights, of the Shadow Catcher. These things that I think that I'll touch upon, but ultimately, maybe the idea is to answer that. How did we get here? Why the critique? Where did that critique come from about Edward Curtis? What were people, upset about? What was happening there? And so for me, I'll start. I do teach art history at WSU. I work with students, and I always tell them, and it's been said before, art history is told by what's left behind. That's what we have. And so how we tell that, how we speak to that is very important. And that can change of how we do. So with that, I think what I'll start with, today is maybe, I have little notes here, and it's never that good because, I'll get off on a tangent. And I think I have a note for something important, and I'll start to go sideways, and I'll go there, I'll lose my focus. And my students play me into this all the time. They know they can get me, off, on something, like that. And so I have to be careful. So thank gosh this isn't an interactive, a lecture, because the students after one class know they can get away with that with Professor Holloman. But I'll start here. And so maybe to contextualize that, this idea that when we look at artwork, we talk about art, we have a great opportunity to walk around that piece, to look at that piece from a multitude of perspectives. We can look at it from a formal perspective and talk about what the elements, what the materials are, how it was put together. We can talk about artist choices, aesthetic. We can talk about its historical context, its cultural context. We can talk about its political context. And all those things are important. And I'll try to maybe touch on some of those things as we look at these things today. But to begin, this idea of going back and thinking about what happened, what changed, how did people start to think differently about Native America. And I always start, in some ways, with this. Teddy Roosevelt's 1905 inaugural parade. And if you'll notice in the hat there, that's Geronimo. And he went down Pennsylvania Avenue with 5 other chiefs, including Quanah Parker. And this was Geronimo that had just been captured on the left not too long before. He's holding a rifle that wasn't his. It was of Captain Henry Ware Lawton. And the reason I named that is because this rifle came up on sale at auction a couple of years ago. And it was the most expensive auction for a rifle ever. And it went for over $1.25 million. And of course, if any of you are in that industry or know that, it's not It's one thing to have the object, but to have the story, to have something that goes, and this is a great example. It's Geronimo's, rifle. Well, it really wasn't. But Geronimo, a lot of people would know, just for the sense of being dramatic. Geronimo going down Pennsylvania Avenue for the president's inaugural parade would be like Osama bin Laden doing that. And because he was that hated, he was that vile to people. He was presented with that. I mean, to such a degree that when Roosevelt was asked, why did you select Geronimo to march in your parade, Mr. President? He gave the greatest single-handed, he's the greatest single-handed murderer in American history. And President Roosevelt says, I wanted to give the people a good show. So by that point, things had changed. The Indian Wars were over. We'd had this transformation into a new century, and the fear of the violent Indian, the savage Indian, had passed. And all of a sudden, people started to look at it differently. And the truth is, but we never asked these Native Americans why they wanted to be there. They were, but it was never really published. But they wanted to be there because they wanted a chance to talk to the president. And their desire to talk to the president was to be able to ask for help, to express what was happening to their people, to have an audience with the president so maybe there could be changes for their people that were suffering tremendously. And that's, but they've got, of course, were corralled into a public event, in lieu of that. We, think back similarly at that time. This was some attitudes. So if we go back east, the attitudes back east were very different than the West. What was happening out here, about the same time. Most people had never encountered Native Americans. They surely heard the stories of their great ancestors' encounters with East Coast tribes. But no, the media had already been really presenting, narratives of what was going on in the West, with the wars in the West. Of course, the most famous one, the Battle of Little Bighorn. So we have Sitting Bull here, and he's on the left, with Buffalo Bill, and Sitting Bull was brought in. Same thing. He wanted a chance to be able to speak to what the challenges were with his people, and he's given an opportunity to participate. But for him, that might give him the opportunity to then have the resources, the ability to speak to the things that were going on. And so, the Wild West show was bringing these pantomimes of the West, the Wild West, for people. They would come and witness that. Of course, in the end, Buffalo Bill, would come in just a minute too late to save Custer. It was always, they had the final fall of Custer, and then Buffalo Bill rides in, and he can't save him, but he can take the first scalp for Custer. And so the audiences went crazy, and that's how that was. But as a side note, and maybe as much as I'm aware of that, and a lot of you are too, forgive me if I'm repeating too much, but it was said and acknowledged that when Sitting Bull was in some of these cities in the East, that he would go out, he was paid $50 a week, which was considerable, and then he was smart enough to try to get a percentage of the money for photographs of him. And when Sitting Bull would be walking and looking around these areas for where they had these big shows, he saw homeless people. And of course, they were begging. And he ended up, as they said, gave his money away. And he didn't understand it. As much as they tried to really highlight and exploit and show what was going on in Washington for tribes that went back east, to impress them with the power of the federal government from a militaristic standpoint, or the just really just, the unbelievable, urban, development. He noticed these people, and he would give his money because he realized, as they said, that he could never call himself a chief if his people were hungry and he wasn't. And he could never be that person. They would never respect him. He wouldn't respect himself if that. And so when he met President Cleveland, Grover Cleveland, that to him, the great chief, he was perplexed by that. So it's, one of those kind of narratives that went along with this here. I think about that because I tell my students we can't talk about Native America in some ways after contact without talking about the federal policies, the legal policies that were enacted to deal with the Native Americans. And for a lot of scholars, it's this ongoing, the Indian problem, from different, federal policies of how they were going to try to work with the people that were there before, Americans, and before that, Europeans. And so the era that I'm kind of focused on here, of course, is the allotment era, or a lot of times the era of assimilation. And so if you take a look at this in some ways, what I'm addressing is this idea that, particularly in the West, and this is, let me clarify that, I'm talking about what was happening, in some ways, after the Civil War and we're west of the Mississippi. And so with that, we're trying to expedite the removal of the tribes as people are moving west, and we have homesteaders and others coming. And the country wasn't really that excited. There were the Indian Wars, but prolonged killing and war was just, I don't know that America had the full belly for that again. But the reality was is we wanted to expedite their removal so we would treaty with them. And doing that, they were given, promises. But as that treaty era started to kind of diminish, there were challenges with it. The federal government recognized the mistake they made in some ways as treating with the Indians initially was they were treating by thinking of allowing the tribes to stay as they were as a tribal body. They were one body of people. And that wasn't working in this idea of moving Native Americans into the modern kind of identity of America. They were keeping their tribal identity with that. So the notion was we need to break that kind of tribal identity up and give them individual identities. Well, what's more individual than the individual ability to own your own land? And so they would offer 160 acres to the head of a family. And they would say, now you can be farmers, or this is what you can do with that. And go on, and that was going to be the kind of goal to assimilate tribal people. The land was not very good. The other thing was it wasn't that successful in a lot of ways because a lot of times the male head of the family was that person. But that didn't stop the federal government from then looking and realizing, well, if we count up all the people we gave the land to, the 160 acres, that leaves us much more land. So where I'm from, on the Colville Indian Reservation, and it's the same as others, it was the biggest land transfer. So when they allowed tribal members to have their individual 160 acres for tribal, head of family, all the rest of the land then became open for settlement. And so it opened up these areas that once were solely tribal reservations. And so if you go through different reservations sometimes and you wonder why you see all these other areas that aren't, by natives, it's because it was under the Allotment Act. They were able at that early time to purchase them and later to get them for 99-year leases, for grazing and that. And so this time frame also, this is one of the probably more popular examples of other attitudes that were taking place at that time, of not just getting Native Americans to assimilate into a lifestyle that was more conducive to other Americans by working their land in that way, but it was also through removing the children and putting them into boarding schools, getting them away and getting them educated. And so this example is probably, as I said, the most prevalent with General Pratt's famous quote of the importance was to save the person, the children, even if he had to kill the Indian in them. Over time, the impact of that became, very knowledgeable, and that had long-term tragic results for so many generations of Indian children. My great-grandfather was a student at Carlisle. He was one of the first ones from our reservation to go back, and he was there when Jim Thorpe was there. And, he had wonderful stories about being there in Pennsylvania and the experience, and I think there were just, some real tragic, stories. But I think the thing that was most prevalent to him was he saw things that were already have happened back east. And so when he came back to our reservation on the Upper Columbia River, he became involved. He was one of our first tribal councilmen. And he was very certain to try to get the Colville tribe to be aware of things that were going to be happening that we needed to prepare for. And one of those things was education, but the control of our own education. How we maintain an education of our children, not just at a cultural level, but as I was always told, it's like a hand. And this is who we are as a people, as a tribe. And there's a few of us that can be right out here at the very end. And they're the ones that are right on that other world. And it's very hard for them, but they're connected. They're right out there. And we need those that can speak the white people's language, understand their culture, but still be connected to the rest of us. That's going to be very important. Not everyone can do that. Some of the people here could never do that. It's too much. But we will have to have some of those that can. And that was always something that I think that was stressed in our family, who that was going to be, how important that was. So to get back to Edward Curtis, and I think it's worthy to talk to Curtis. I've been involved this last year a bit on this Beyond the Frame project that's been taking place in Washington and within the region of different communities, tribal communities, museums, others re-examining Edward Curtis and his work and talking about, as the title, Beyond the Frame, going beyond Curtis's images and trying to engage the communities and the people that he was engaged with at that time. So when I think about, Curtis here and this image of Princess Angeline, this is Chief Seattle's daughter. And so just the notion that it was Princess Angeline, once again, it really gives this kind of romantic, this idea of the Native American chief's daughter. And I always laugh about that in some ways because it speaks as much to a non-Native culture when we use that kind of terminology. Because for almost all the Native cultures that I've encountered, we're matriarchal. It's a female. A lot of the family things go down female lines. The power of the women is very important. We can't exist without the women's songs and the women's engagement and ritual and all those things. And so I had an aunt one time tell me that, why she never really got involved in the women's movement in the 60s. And she said, well, because we already kind of did what we wanted to do. We already kind of had that power. I mean, I don't discredit, she said, what other women are after, of course. But it just isn't our culture. And she said the way her aunts had explained it to her is like, men, we let them do that. They're like, if you look out in nature and you see the male birds and this with all their plumes, and they got to do all these things and dance around, or the bucks with their horns, and they got to fight and do. Okay, but men are like that too. They're kind of one-dimensional. And but in other aspects, behind that kind of public presentation of all that, there's always women. And they're invested in everything. And if it was another lecture another time about termination or that, I'd be telling you how women saved the tribes. After the men came back from World War II and fell into alcoholism and other issues, and it was for the first time that women stepped up publicly to take over council positions, to take over positions within our tribes. And so we could go on and on again just about that. But so to call her Princess Angeline is this kind of notion of the Indian princess. And that was very important with non-native writers, such as Nathaniel Hawthorne and others. But this image was important for Curtis because it really speaks to his idea of being close to something that was ready to go away. And so the story of Princess Angeline and Curtis is in Seattle, that she was still there down in the mud flats gathering clams and that, while Seattle already had become the city. And she was this kind of vestige of maybe what had been. Now, when I look at this, I think what had been for some time changed. So if this image was 1898, then what I would tell you in Puget Sound in 1854 was the Medicine Creek Treaty. And the Medicine Creek Treaty was there at the Nisqually Delta. I guess the Nisquallies are proud that I brought that up. But so with that, the tribes of Puget Sound were removed to 3 different kind of reservations. And, but they were able to negotiate, even as they're being removed from right there on Puget Sound to some of these significant areas, a treaty that said that they would receive, Governor Stevens, the territorial governor at that time, that they would get half the salmon and half the shellfish. So maybe in 1854, they might have been about half the population. So maybe that seemed like a good plan. Okay. Well, that was prior to this, and they really were out of sight, out of mind by the time that Curtis is taking this image in Seattle of Princess Angeline. And they're off on these reservations, removed from the growth of Seattle and other urban centers on Puget Sound. 1858, if you're aware of what was going on in eastern Washington, that's when General Wright was able to apprehend Qualchin, the Yakima chief, after wars there of 4 Lakes and Steptoe Butte, and had him hung. Okay. It was that dramatic because there was this, that was this transformation in this Washington territory of that the Indian uprisings were pretty close. As they thought at that time, they were over. The federal government has shown its might and had made examples of not just 2 famous chiefs, but multiple, numerous tribal members that came in with a white flag to try to negotiate and were immediately hung by General George Wright. So when I think of Princess Angeline at that time, that idea had already passed by decades. People had really not had this interaction. So the fact that she was still there, I think, touched upon this notion of Curtis himself wasn't going up to these reservations, wasn't spending time. No one really was. They were involved in other activities. Seattle had already had the transformation from a small kind of lumber town, port town to the city that it is today. But it was really in 1903 that Curtis made this transition, this jump, was when Chief Joseph was in Seattle. And he was brought there. Timothy Egan gives a nice narrative of this in his book, by the way. And so with that, he addresses, similar to what was happening with Geronimo and others as they were going back to Washington, D.C., Joseph was hoping a chance to be able to express his plight, to have his people return back home to the Wallowa Valley in eastern Oregon. He had been since 1885, I want to say, on the Colville Indian Reservation after they were exiled to Oklahoma after the War of 1877. So the last of the Indian Wars was 1877, and that was Joseph's escape away from federal forces and almost to the Canadian border there to be at that time with Sitting Bull. But that was what was covered in every major newspaper throughout America. And so when Joseph met Curtis, he was one of the most famous chiefs at that time. And so the image that he took, and it's one of these things is, I imagine that he was able at the time, he dressed as he wanted to try to get an audience so he could express the concerns that he had with the right political figures so they could return home. He was never allowed to return home. It was interesting, though. I have family friends that are Nez Perce, part of the Joseph Band on the Colville Reservation from Nespelem. And they've always told me this, that the Joseph Band wanted to stay in Nespelem, or they went there because they were offered the opportunity to keep their religious belief, their spiritual beliefs, which was the seven drum religion, the Washoe religion, which they followed. That if they were going to go back to Lapwai or go back to Idaho, that they were expected to become Christian. And they would rather go to the home of what their traditional enemies were, which historically they had warred with the tribes of that region. And they decided to stay there. And after Joseph died, not long after this picture was taken, a couple years, I think, the Nez Perce stayed there, and they're there to this day at Nespelem, and they're a very important part of the Colville. So this got Curtis, of course, going on his idea once he got the attention of most of these, that he had a project, of course, and his project was to document the tribes of the West in an authentic manner before they disappeared, before their traditional ways were gone. And so for posterity, he transformed himself not just into a photographer, a documentary photographer, but he was going to do the research and writing. So I had this wonderful, and I have to thank University of Oregon and our staff that hosted me yesterday. I had a chance to look at the Curtis portfolio here at the special collections. And it's remarkable. It really is. It's something else. But what we had this ability to do was to talk about the portfolio from multiple perspectives. And I was mentioning to them, whether we talk about it from a cultural, historic, aesthetic, all the different ways we could look at these images. But the truth is also they're very valuable. And there was only so many of them made, a couple hundred, and the price of them now, if you have the complete portfolio, is pretty significant. It was a long, trying effort for Curtis to get this done. So as he was pursuing this, and as he was working out of his studio and then starting to travel to go to these different reservations and tribes that he wanted to document, America was moving on as it has. And I put this print in from Stieglitz around that same era because I think it's important. If I'm going to talk to my students, to contextualize what else was going on, if we have what was going on in the West, this was happening, back east. But I would talk about this image in a different way. I would mention this thing that I always try to work with my students on is this kind of term, when the form works, you don't see it. So a formal decision, an artistic decision, an artistic eye, that if we work out the formal qualities of how do we construct a visual image in a horizontal rectangle, which this is, and we organize it with the visual elements of line, shape, value, color, whatever elements we're working with, and that form is done well, then we don't see it. And what I mean by that is our eyes aren't stuck on what's not working. We are fabulous. We've been exposed. We're very good at seeing images. All of us are. We're exposed to them all. And so we have an acute eye to see if something's balanced, it has good contrast, how these things work. But when that's taken care of from an artistic level, then we get to go deeper into the content, into the image. And I make that point with my students too, the difference between subject matter and content. The subject matter is a train and a train switching yard somewhere in an urban city, maybe close to night. Okay, that's the subject matter. The content is that subject matter enhanced, dramatized, intensified by the artistic choices of the contrast, the lighting, all these things. And so if that form is taken care of, we get to then go deeper into it. And we see it with the imaginative eyes. We see it with an eye of other qualities that we look at it. And that is something that's really important. And I'm sorry if I'm kind of going into for all of you docents, if there are docents here, can I see any hands? Well, okay, we have, but this is what we do, and it's wonderful when we're working in museums to talk about these things. Because if I go from that and this idea, when a photographer is looking through the lens, and I'm no offense to any younger people here, but I'm going to use a term that you'd never heard. It's called shutterbug. Okay, and versus all of us shutterbugs when we actually had a real camera, not a phone. And when we would take pictures to document what was no longer there. We would take a picture to say, this is what was there, it's not there anymore, but now this is what I have. And that's our intention. Okay, but a photographer, when they were looking through the lens of a camera, they're already thinking what I can do with that information. And that information at that point, for a lot of times, was in the dark room. So they had to have a skill set of how they can manipulate the image in the dark room. So when they were looking at something, they're already thinking what this could be as a photograph, what this could be in the dark room. So this idea then, that the image is not just what it is, it's how it is. It was really important, and this is a great example of that. So the quality of that. Of course this was going to happen, because when the camera came out, it changed painters. Painting became about the paint, not about the content, because paint could create emotion and do things that just a strict image couldn't. So people started to be aware of how the camera, they wanted the idea of photography to go further than just documenting the truth. And Curtis was quite aware of this. And this is maybe one of the most famous images of Curtis, is, particularly of the vanishing. There's a couple from this series, where the other one, I didn't put it up here and I apologize, is almost the same kind of group of people going off into the sunset. And the vanishing race. And I got to actually see this yesterday, and it was fabulous, the actual print, and to be there and see that. But, so he was very conscious of this aesthetic. He was conscious. He was such a good craftsman. So if he took care of everything, we could go in and he was aware of how we'd feel. He was playing into that. He knew this kind of feel that we would have of the people, especially when he names it the vanishing race. I guess that helped. But as this progressed, he continued on with this pursuit of documenting and working, with the people. And so, with that, the idea that, he would be able to, continue on and document all these cultures. He did these wonderful video, The Land of the Headhunters, and that you might want to check that out. That's quite nice. So if there's, this idea that what we're kind of looking at is this notion that, he's perpetuating this kind of idea of Native Americans that, in some ways keeps them in the past, holds them in the diorama, that there's something we can only look at behind us. Vine Deloria Sr. expressed that, this idea that I'm sorry that natives are here and we see it differently. My first experience might have been with Gerald Visner. He did this wonderful article I had in graduate school, and it was called Socio-Acupuncture, the myth reversal in 4 scenes. And he was the first to kind of criticize that I'd read, where he was really in an academic form criticizing, Curtis specifically. And that was taken on a pretty hallowed figure at that time. But this sense that Native America is still here, we're not vestiges of the past. To look for some authenticity in that expectation, for people to have to live up to that is really challenging. So he used this example. And this is one of the sepia-toned, wonderful images in a pagan lodge, the Blackfeet. He went out to the Blackfeet reservation, and he took this photograph, and beautiful, stunning inside a lodge, a father and son, and this was the original. Do you see any difference? So, as Gerald Visner said in Socio-Acupuncture, striptease, that he, and this was before Photoshop, by the way, it was quite an effort for him to get that clock out of there. But Visner said that what he did was he did not allow the Indians to live in real time. That the world that they were living in, that clock meant something to them. It was given, they were proud of it. But Curtis did not want that in his image. It was a sign of modernity. He was trying to present them in an authentic manner, which he dictated was authentic. So we jumped to someone else that was working at that same time frame, and that was Frank Matsura. And he immigrated to the Okanagan, which is the Okanagan Valley, north of Wenatchee, Washington, if you go in the upper Columbia. And that, of course, goes all the way up into Canada, where Penticton is. And why he showed up there, and that is a kind of there's not a lot of information on Matsura of the whys. We do know he left Japan, he came, and this kind of idea that, one of the things about Matsura, and I wrote this note down, and so I'm not going to go sideways. I know I'm going long, but I wanted to write this because I was thinking about this morning. This Fukazawa Yukichi was this very famous Japanese writer, philosopher, advocate of Western civilization. He was from a samurai family also, but he was a scholar. If you've been to Japan, he's on their money. He founded one of their most prominent universities. He wrote numerous books, but he wanted to send out these young men of ability into the world. Not to go learn primarily from other countries, but to also show that Japan was a civilized nation. Japan was one of the top nations in the world. And it was also to show who they were, that they were equal in their culture and that. And so with that, I think it was really important to mention there's a lot of suggestion that Matsura was one of these people. He just never really went back home. And so with that, unfortunately, he died early. But why Matsura? He worked. He made his way up, got his own little photography studio. And he worked in this pioneer town where you had men with 6 guns, people on their way up to the gold fields in Alaska, ranchers. The Okanagan was in the lower 48, kind of the last of some of this pioneer town. But take a look at this image by Matsura. What do you see that the person has in their hand? He didn't edit out the clock. And they were proud of that. And so for me, I want to acknowledge just this image here was also, it's a great image. And if I can do a quote here, so taking a look at Matsura, I took this image. I knew about it, but it's from Shipu Wang's article also, between going native in America's borderland, Frank Matsura's photographic miscegenation. And he was talking about the diaspora, the borderlands, but he said that what Frank Matsura did is he inserted himself into these images to break that image of authenticity for natives. He was a part of that community. He all the time had fun placing himself in with the native people and engaging that. So he was subverting that kind of authentic pose that everyone else kind of wanted. And so he worked in the communities, he lived with the people, and he did these fabulous photographs of the people as they were. What was happening in this time of transition for Native Americans in the Okanagan. And those are those big Angora chaps, the ones on the right. But he had a phenomenal aesthetic eye. He really, the glass plates, the original glass plates are in Okanagan County Museum, and then Washington State University has Dr. Brown's photographs and notes of Matsura. So between the two, those are where the holdings of all of, primarily of Frank Matsura's work is. Yes?
And if you go to the town of Okanagan, there are murals everywhere.
Yes, there are. Yes, there are. And sadly, when he died, there just wasn't a place big enough to have everyone go to his funeral. He was that connected, this immigrant that became a huge part of that community. And I talk about this image because in some ways what he presents here to me isn't just this going away. This is the opposite for me in some way of Curtis's vanishing race. This is who the Indian women were. They were strong. They were determined. They were going to work. They set a precedent. This is what you expected. And that she's going to be packing that wood. She's going to be doing the work. And this is what we saw growing up. This is what people see in their communities. That is taken as a very serious thing. And so I always thought of this woman coming by every day outside of Matsura's studio, and one of these days he's going to take that photograph. And he finally did. So by the time the end of Matsura, the whole idea of the West is over. The new century has begun, and we're thinking about, the modern era, and that's celebrated, of course, at the Panama Pacific exhibition. The incandescent lights, other, new technology, and the winner of the gold medal that year in sculpture is this most iconic, famous, image by James Earl Fraser, the end of the trail. The Indian on his horse with a flaccid spear, no longer a threat, riding off into the sunset. You've seen probably a lot of these on velvet with your black lights. But, contemporary terminology says, they've adopted the critique of the female gaze, the imposition of women, of the photographer, of the artist, and the expectation of how women are supposed to be, how they're supposed to look, how they're supposed to behave, how we interpret women, and the impact, negative impact, of course, that has had on femininity. So if we take that same consideration and that power of and impose that into Native America, that same expectation of what American Indians are supposed to look like, how they're supposed to be, to the point that all American men are supposed to have long hair, and God forbid if you're from a different tribe and you're not a Plains tribe, because we had to ride horses, and the horse only came out to this region in 1700, at least to the plateau. So these kind of ideas, but we think about how these images are constructed. So the final change for me really came at the Museum of Man in San Diego with James Luna. And he did this exhibition, and he placed all these different artifacts and things in these cases. And just as like here, they had the opening, and he'd laid himself down in a breechcloth, and people didn't know he was alive. And he just laid there. And of course, the Indian as an artifact. And then when he got up, people freaked out. But that was the point, is this performance piece, is we're not gone. You know, and this was during this era of, they were starting to really push for NAGPRA, Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act. How do we return human remains? How do we, you know, all these holdings of museums that had all these bodies, you know, that they used for study, you know, and so he did this, and it really kind of changed and transformed, you know, a lot of ideas, I think, for a lot of contemporary Native artists. And then he took on those stereotypes, those ideas that were put out there. And if there were children here, I changed it. I'll give you a second to read that. And the Lisweno were from San Diego, and he was a social worker. So as great as his success and career as an artist was before he died, he maintained his job working with the community as a social worker, which says something about James Luna. So as I finish up, I had the chance to meet Larry McNeil. I worked on a committee with him. He's Tlingit, and he's a photographer at Boise State, still there in their department. And so these ideas of Native Americans pushing back, challenging the expectation. Of course, he came across this, had to get his camera out, set it up, took a photograph of himself in a small town, the Southwest, next to the, and dare I say, the res car, which he was really proud of. But this is maybe what he's maybe most known for, this series. And so he transformed, and I get a chance to do this again. This is Edward Curtis. And some of you might have thought it was Indiana Jones, and I think that they stole the Indiana Jones look from Edward Curtis. And this is General Pratt. And so he's reversing, you know, the narrative. And here's the artist right here with his camera. And these are his family photos. So he's changed in that narrative. He was involved in this exhibition, the juxtaposition of these images again, giving back the time. And if we think, if you had the chance to be up in Portland recently for the Wendy Red Star installation, it was a real treat. We had her at WSU recently, a little over a year ago. This is her kind of most famous piece, the Four Seasons piece. I say most famous, but I think it really brought her the national, international notoriety. But similar to Matsura, she places herself in the image. And in doing so, deconstructs and breaks down that notion of authenticity, you know, where she utilizes traditional dress, the elk teeth dress of the Crow people where she's from, but at the same time poses and places these kind of expectations of Native America, this kind of the land. The one I love the most, of course, is her inflatable elk here. But just these kind of ideas, and it's a wonderful, because it has a sense of humor, and I think that's important. The seriousness, of course, has been there, and that serious critique is worthy. But if you've had the chance, and like any of us, you know, the sense of humor matters, because some things, humor can also be very powerful. And for Native people, it's very powerful. Sometimes humor, I am supposed to be done. I've gone way past, so I'll hurry up here. But, you know, I like that and had the chance to meet her, and that is very evident. But this is, in some ways, maybe, you know, where I kind of want to finish up with these, is this is an image that she did up at Portland 2014, I believe. And It was at the Portland Art Museum. And what she did here, which is so wonderful, is she was involved doing research, which she was always really good at, and she came across these images of a delegation, a Crow delegation that went back to Washington, D.C. in 1880, and found these images, and she knew the family members, the descendants of this chief, Medicine Crow. And she saw it and realized, like a lot of the images of Native America, there was no other information. They were taking the image to perpetuate or have the Indian chief or to present that. But who was it? Who were they? What was about them? So what she did was she did these annotations of different things about Medicine Crow, talked to his family, got personal information, found out why they were able to wear some of these things, these warriors, why they only wore ermine on their pants, why they could wear a particular feather when they counted coup, or all these different things. So they weren't just about what it was to be a warrior, but also little funny things. She added like what his stare was looking back into the camera or doing other things, and they were fabulous. One even to the point with one of the series she did of that he later in life on the reservation, he and some other men caught some people stealing horses and they killed him. And then he shook hands with the Indian agent with that person's hand that he cut off. And so, just adding these different elements to who this person was, because it was bringing back to life. It was important that she brought some of who that person was, because so many of these images were just taken for the subject matter, never really interested in a contextual content more of who these people were. So I did a presentation a number of years ago on Curtis, and it was horrible because someone had read the Egan book, it was right after it had come out, and thought I was being way too critical of Curtis and then, of course, Egan, because I put this quote up by Renato Rosaldo. And it wasn't fair. And I'm not saying today it is or isn't that I can defend it, but I will tell you people absolutely feel this. That in this sense of imperialist nostalgia, where at times we romanticize those things that we were actually invested in destroying. And that's about as harsh as you can say with that. But I think contextually, a lot of Native people absolutely sense this, and they would point to Curtis's images. But somewhere way back, before all this happened, when David Thompson came down the Columbia in 1809, about, I think, 6 years after Lewis and Clark came down the lower Columbia, he stopped at Kettle Falls, where my people are from, and commented. And then not long after that, Paul Kane came through and did paintings there as they were coming out west. So this is one of the first pictorial kind of photographic images, or not photographic, painted images depicting the Native people of this region. And of course, this was not nearby of the Indians. You would see the same thing at Celilo Falls if you had gone up. These big, huge fish hatcheries. And this is what the ceremony of tears was when they raised the level of Grand Coulee Dam and flooded these falls for the last time when they created the reservoir. And this image is the first only color film of the ceremony. All the tribes that used to meet at Kettle Falls came to say goodbye to their way of life and the salmon fishing. And their salmon people that they had engaged with for, millennia more. And my mother was here with my family. when she was young. She was 9 years old. And this came to the Northwest Museum of Arts and Culture probably about a little less than 10 years ago. And there was a gentleman that owned the funeral home that was involved with the federal government of digging up human remains, tribal burial grounds before the river was flooded, so they could study the cranial and other aspects of them. And he had a camera and took this film. And what's so wonderful, you'll see here in a second, is our last hereditary chief for the Colville people. His name's Chief Jim James, and they called him Judge James. And there's all these wonderful black and white images of him, but really rarely any in color. And so there he is in the middle. And we used to have these elderly women come to the collections at the museum. And I'd mentioned something about Jim James. And they're looking at all the, oh, he was so handsome. Oh, when we were young, we all just thought he was so handsome. And he was. And with that, I want to say thank you very much.
I think we have time for some questions. If anyone has one, we'd like you to use the microphone so everyone can hear you. So we'll bring around a mic to you. I see a hand in the back here.
Now, I apologize. I tried to go long so I wouldn't have any questions, because I'm terrible at them. But I'll do the best I can.
Well, I don't need no stinking microphone. A comment and question about the imagery of Curtis and your critique. During those images during the early 1900s, there was also the golden age of coinage in America.
Yes.
And you mentioned James O. Frazier. He had one of the best coins ever made.
The Buffalo.
The Buffalo nickel.
Yeah.
From 1913 to 1930, I believe. Also, he came out with it was an Oregon 50-cent piece.
Oh, I didn't know.
Commemorative coin. They only came out once a year in the early 20s and 30s. And that one got extended for 10 years, the only commemorative piece. And he did a design, one of the most beautiful coins ever made, of the Oregon Trail. And it has this great Indian on the Native American on the coin. Beautiful coin, 1926 Oregon 50 cents commemorative coin. Also, the $5 bill from 1898 has this most beautiful American bill ever made. It has this beautiful Indian chief on the front. So during the same time period as these the photographers here. One comment I have to ask or question is, and your feeling is, some years ago you talked about appropriation, Native American appropriation, and there was a school that had this beautiful, I forgot which school it was, and it was in the Upper Plains States, and it was this beautiful warrior, and the town, and I don't know who it was, but they finally got it axed, erased, political correctness and all this. It was this beautiful piece, and I wanted to know your feelings on that, because I've heard that some Native Americans don't have an issue with that, but yet we still have the Cleveland Indians logo, which makes the Native American look like a clown. So that's my question.
When I was at the Northwest Museum of Arts and Culture in Spokane as the director of their American Indians programs and exhibits, the Spokane Indian tribe was working with the Spokane Indians AAA baseball team. And people felt that they should change their name because the Spokane Indians baseball team, to use Indian, was inappropriate. The Spokane tribe had worked with them and chose that they were going to allow the baseball team to keep their name, the Indians. And that really put some people off. So much so that some people from the American Indian movement came out and were speaking in a very critical way of the Spokane tribe. I remember one of the main gentlemen said, well, I wouldn't expect anything different from Fort Indians, which was a derogatory term of Native Americans, those that just stayed by the fort and got the free handouts. And they came to the museum and asked me what I thought about that. And I said, well, I could see both sides. I could argue both sides, surely, of that. But what's not, in my opinion, being addressed by the American Indian Movement representative, or that, is the Spokane tribe is using their sovereign rights as a tribe to go into negotiations with the Spokane Indians baseball team. And if there's one thing all tribes are together on, is to maintain and uphold those sovereign rights that says that the Grand Ronde cannot tell one of the other tribes what to do, nor can the Cowlitz tell the Grand Ronde what to do. That their sovereign rights are theirs. And Native Americans are different. They're all different. And so if the Spokane tribe chooses to work with the Spokane Indians, and what they did was they used native language, and they had different events for the community to come. They had all these things, cultural opportunities for people come to the baseball game to engage with who the indigenous people of that region were. I guess to answer your question, I could see how some people would be absolutely offended, and others, I've heard a lot of Native people say, yeah, I get this Cleveland Indians issue, without a doubt. But there are very few Native Americans on reservations. That's not even close to the top thing on their agenda of what needs to change. There is fetal alcohol syndrome, suicide, all these horrible death rates and poverty. Yeah, changing the mascot, great. But those people aren't coming out and trying to change other things.
Maybe one or two more questions?
Thank you so much for this wonderful talk.
Thank you.
My question has to do with, I love the humor of James Luna and Wendy Red Star, but is there a tension within the contemporary Native artist community about feeling an obligation to edify and kind of do the emotional labor of very much like teaching the rest of the United States about how wrong people have been, and is there a pushback and a desire to have this opacity and remain like to not have to do that labor and to necessarily their expectation of always edifying the rest of us?
I think that's a wonderful thing to aspire to in all aspects of our ability to recognize other people's perspectives and what their challenges are. I think that the art has become a wonderful vehicle for that. It's really had a chance to get out there and do that. Great writing, great writers have been able to do that. But still, it's a difficult thing because Native America still is there's not a lot of integration. There's tribal communities and non-tribal communities, and a lot of times the two do not meet. And so it does take a lot. I say this when I worked at the museum, we worked with a lot of the tribal representatives. They'd come into Spokane, they'd spend time with us at the museum, and it was, in many ways, it was a certain group of people that took on so much for their communities to be that person, as I did with the hand, right, that went out into those other areas and spoke and presented and did that work. And my hat's off to that. Every community has those people. And they've invested, they put themselves, they took so much of themselves to try to do that. And it's necessary, but I know for a lot of them it's just ongoing, and it's really challenging. And maybe because in other media or other forms we're not as involved, so people don't see it in the same way as they see other things.
Okay, so
One-
just
Bring around a question to the back.
Not a big microphone person, so we'll see how this works out. Hello. I just wanted to thank you again for coming out and sharing your perspectives.
Thank you very
and,
much.
And sharing some other artists that I wasn't aware of, so I'm looking forward to learning about them. I wanted to make a comment about your observations about people's love affair with the images of things that they don't necessarily really want to spend time learning more about. As a professional wildlife biologist, I find that interesting. That same sort of things occurs with our natural world, where we love, the images of grizzly bears and wolves, but when it comes to actually spending time with those organisms, we're not so keen on that. So
Yeah.
I really appreciate that.
Well, thank you.
All right, I think our last question back here.
thank you so much for this lecture. I have a question about what do you think is the role for the younger generation, especially with the social media, to raise an awareness about the issues that the Native American have?
Well, we had a bit of a conversation about this yesterday, and just how quickly information moves, how quickly images move, and maybe a change of engagement with material, culture, the object, these things. That's interesting, and maybe the downside, how interpretations could be quickly presented with that. I said something yesterday to some colleagues, and I didn't address it, and maybe this is a chance to do this. If you remember back when I had the image of Chief Joseph, my great-grandfather's older brother had met Joseph there at Nespelem, and had told my grandmother what that meeting was like. And he said the interesting thing about Joseph was, if you asked him something, didn't mean he was going to answer you. That was the first thing. Just by asking people something didn't mean they were obligated to answer you. And those were cultural things, but they were also an age. Some information wasn't for younger people, particularly with some of these things, because in knowledge and those things, they have power, and that power could hurt someone if they weren't prepared for that knowledge. And I'm not using this to answer yours, but what he said that was interesting about Joseph was that he'd listen and think about what you asked, and then he would give you 4 different ways that you could answer that. And my old grandmother, I was in graduate school then when she told me that, and she goes, "I don't want you to talk about that now, Michael. When you come back next trip, we'll talk about that. I want you to think about what I just said." I said, "Oh, okay." So I got back to graduate school, and a couple months later, I go back home, and "Grandma, I want to talk." "I knew you wanted to talk about that. What do you think?" I said, "Well, I thought about it, and what I thought about is that he listened to everyone, because they'd be in a situation as a chief," because she said everyone wanted to be the chief. That's what you want to be the chief. Well, no, if you knew what a chief had to go through, you wouldn't want to be the chief. But as the chief, when there was a situation, he'd have to listen to the war chief, to the women, to the spiritual people. He'd have to listen to everyone. And then what he did was he would then tell you from different perspectives how different people saw this situation. And he could speak, because he'd listen to them, he could speak to each of their perspectives on how they might think about that. But then he had to make a decision because he was the chief. And then he'd say, "I will tell you this is what we're going to do, but this is why. And I respect what your position was. I respect what yours was, and I respect what yours was." And I do hope in this age of social media, of all the different technology and that that we still have the ability to be critical, we still have the ability to listen, and we still have the ability to recognize different points of view. And that we honor that, even if we do have to still move together in one group. And I hope it's not being dictated to us solely by that medium.
Thank you so much for your talk today, Professor
Thank you.
Holloman. Yeah.